Hello and welcome to the next episode of the Existential Files. Good afternoon, Matthew.
Hello, Louie.
Hello. So
hello. Who have we got today?
hello. Well, we have another guest joining us, a very, very special guest. I think I was just saying might be too clever for this podcast. He's making me feel rather stupid. We have a prolific fantasy author, and I believe you've got a PhD. Is that right, Scott?
Oh no, it's kind of a funny story. I quit my PhD, which was on fundamental ontology, after realizing that I went on a huge neuroscience reading binge, realizing that it was a complete crock.
Right. Well, I haven't introduced. So I'll say, our Scott Bakker, I believe. Right. Do you want to introduce yourself properly, then, Scott?
Yeah, I'm a full-time fantasy writer. I'm best known for a series of fantasy books called The Prince of Nothing and The Aspect Emperor. I have the 7th book of the series coming out this summer. And my whole shtick, I guess you could say, is using the fantastic in arts and culture as a means of diagnosing the health of human meaning and human meaning making.
Which, I mean, this sounds really interesting because I must admit, I read Lord of the Rings when I was a kid. I absolutely hated the book. I must admit, this is probably quite an unpopular. This is probably quite an unpopular opinion, but I fucking hated Tolkien, and I thought it was the most boring book I'd ever read in my life. Right. So I feel a bit of a charlatan because I normally we like to read or know something about the person. But I'm afraid to say, I mean, I've read your Journal of Consciousness paper a couple of times, but I haven't read any of your fantasy. Am I going to find your fantasy interesting? Because the way you've sold it to me, I want to go and read it.
Well, you probably hate it. I mean, the books aren't for everybody. I mean, that's definitely the case. But Tolkien, I mean, I call him Papa Tolkien. So, and I love my dad.
I mean, look, I would be wrong to say I mean, I was probably 10 or 11 when I read, Tolkien the first, and I mean, I was always more of a Douglas Adams kind of guy. So, I don't know about you, Matthew. What's your experience of fantasy?
Well, I don't know whether I was happy or sad to say that I was more of a Douglas Adams fan myself. But in terms of your particular genre, then, Scott. So I like the title, "The Prince of Nothing." Does sound something quite existential within that. Is there something there you can, without just kind of getting too drawn into the fantasy side of it, or something that Louie may bulk at? So the Prince of Nothing, are we talking about something here that sounds rather existential?
Oh, most definitely. Actually, when I was writing my dissertation, it was on fundamental ontology and primarily inspired by Heidegger. And so, I mean, existential themes were my bread and butter for probably first 2 decades of my reading life. Definitely not an existentialist myself, but the books carry over those themes, explore those themes in ways that hopefully relate to readers in their everyday lives, fantasy or not.
I mean, I'm kind of surprised you. So you said you're not an existentialist yourself, and is that right?
No.
Scott?
Yeah.
And is that so? What do you want to explain that to us?
The problem I have with continental philosophy, which was primarily my training when I was in university, is simply that, I mean, for me, it just it puts the theoretical cart before the horse. It just presumes that there's this region that we can reflect upon that comes before absolutely any other type of knowledge that we could create. So for a fundamental ontologist like Heidegger, or say a more classic existentialist like Sartre, really what comes first is just simply this matter of lived life that we seem to find ourselves immersed in all the time. And that's a condition of possibility of doing science. So whatever science can tell us about this lived life always has to come after some kind of analysis of this lived life. And when you lose faith in our ability to analyze lived life in a way that generates anything approaching knowledge, you lose the ability to basically be an existentialist.
Stunned silence. Go on, Louie. Come back on that one if you remain fashionable.
No, I mean, I can't say. I mean, so if we move on to your journal of consciousness, I mean, does this relate to what your journal of consciousness paper that's the alien? I can't remember the title. I've got it in front of me.
Alien philosophy.
On alien philosophy, because I mean, I must admit, I was reading your very interesting blog. I think it's 3 Pound Brain. Is that right?
Yeah.
And I was reading this, and I was going, I don't bloody understand a word of half of this. But I think part of it is, as you know, we're both psychologists, and I think that psychology, you know, I don't have a massive experience in, say, academic philosophy. So some of this we discover anew, I think. But I mean, if I understood your paper correctly, I mean, I broadly agreed with a lot of it. I mean, and I think I've got a question here that I prepared. So tell us, what do you mean? What is the blind brain theory? Tell us about that then, Scott.
Well, the blind brain theory is just simply a way of approaching the question of our ability to cognize ourselves that is rigorously naturalistic. And the notion is that if you are honest to the ecological nature of human cognition and the heuristic nature of human cognition, then you realize that we really have these rather profound blinders that we need to overcome if we're going to make any sense whatsoever of whatever it is we seem to find ourselves stranded in when we seek to reflect upon experience. And the blind brain theory essentially says, look, there really is no insuperable divide between the first person and the third person. It only appears that way. And it appears that way for 2 primary reasons. The first reason is simply neglect. Philosophical reflection or reflection upon experience, that's not something we evolved to do theoretically. I mean, we've evolved to do it practically. It pays dividends to be able to catch your tongue at the family Christmas dinner, to be able to say, oh, I don't want to say that before saying that, pays potentially huge social dividends. It pays to be able to reflect upon, the mistakes one's made when trying to accomplish a task. But when you ask yourself what it is a brain is trying to do when it's attempting to get a grasp on its own operations, and you realize the, unbelievable intractability of the complexities involved, then suddenly you see that really what we call metacognition is a very, very special, consists of probably a family of very, very special purpose devices that, were filtered by practical problems that faced our ancestors. And at some point, we learned that we could actually repurpose, exact these metacognitive capacities without really thinking about those capacities and how they themselves have to be limited. And so the problem really becomes one of neglect. So we reflect upon our experience, but we're using our reflective capacities in a way they were never evolved to be used. So there's just simply no way to flag the limits of those capacities. So we simply assume, because of neglect, that we have the information available that we need to solve those problems. And for me, philosophical existentialism is almost wholly an artifact of running afoul different cognitive illusions that I think you can posit on empirical grounds that you could suggest that human beings as a whole would be likely to suffer. And the paper on alien philosophy is the attempt to sort of lay that out, through the guise of asking, what a convergent alien species might suffer, philosophically reflecting.
And I think I understand. I mean, I think I agree with you on one level. I mean, I definitely agree. That I mean, and I've been writing quite a lot on my blog, for example, about how evolution sets up the chessboard. And I definitely think we are constrained by evolution. One of the kind of themes of the podcast, and I think one of the much earlier podcasts episodes Matt and I were talking about what did the brain evolve to do, and it certainly didn't evolve to do the kind of things that you and I are doing now, and discussing what the brain is doing. And so I mean, and I think that's part of what you're saying. Is that true?
It's definitely part, and yeah. I would argue that there's actually something incredibly obvious there that, for whatever reason, we are almost constitutively programmed to overlook. I mean, because what it means is that if that we're using these mechanisms in ways they weren't designed to be used, then we really should expect to find our history of using these mechanisms to be littered with examples of that misfit. We really should expect to look back at the history of philosophical reflection, say, and find it littered with all kinds of basically cognitive psychological artifacts of the misapplication of metacognitive capacities to various types of problems and questions. Are you familiar with Eric Schwitzgebel at all?
No.
No? He's got a wonderful book. What's it called again? Jeez, holy cow. He's going to kick
Great
me in
title
the
of the book. I love the title of that book. What's it called again?
Oh my God, he's going to kick my ass.
Oh my God, yeah.
I have it here. I'll find it. But anyways, he gives a great example of mental imagery. And, I mean, if you just think, like if you pause and imagine your house. Okay, so you have this mental image of your house in your head. Now I can ask you, what direction is the sunlight reflecting off the windows in that mental image, right? I mean, some people, when I ask this question, they'll say, oh, I think it's, southward, something like that, right? And then my follow-up question is was that actually in your image before I asked you, or did that just jump into your image? I mean, the point is that mental imagery, I mean, there's information there, but the ways we can use that information are actually very, very constrained. All you got to do is look at, compare your mental image of a house to a photograph of your house, and just list all the kinds of questions you can competently answer on the basis of those two sources of information. And suddenly you see that mental imagery is actually probably a much more specific type of device than a photograph is, as far as answering, what is type questions. And I'm basically saying that follows for experience as a whole, that what we all are doing, psychologists, philosophers, imams, is basically asking questions of our experience that our brains just simply have no capacity to answer. But not only do they not have the capacity to answer that question, they also neglect that incapacity. So you have this sort of double blind problem that puts us in an explanatory double blind. And that's what gives rise to all these so-called hard problems that we find ourselves tangled up with now.
Now, we had Susan Blackmore on the podcast a few weeks ago.
I love Susan.
And I mean, she basically, if I understood her argument correctly, was arguing that consciousness is a delusion, that there's no such thing as consciousness. I mean, is that how you understood it, Matt?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure how. See, when people like Susan Blackmore or myself or Dan Dennett is probably the most sort of famous example. I mean, when we use the word illusion, I mean, typically what we're talking about is not simply, is consciousness illusory? Is there such a thing as consciousness? What we're talking about is consciousness what it appears to us to be? And that, for me, is an incredibly important distinction. You need to separate appearance consciousness from consciousness, whatever it actually ends up consisting in. I mean, everyone has their pet theories, their pet suspicions. And until you do that, until you're actually able to sort appearance consciousness out from the actual phenomena that we're chasing, we're going to be stuck chasing will-o'-the-wisps and running in circles, never able to even agree on formulations of our explananda, let alone explain anything.
So can I ask the question then, so if I have been following some of this up to a point, so the whole idea of to me the key word is metacognition or metacognitive processes, that consciousness essentially is one way of describing that ability to reflect upon the cognitive process itself or reflect upon ourselves. And so what you're saying is then, so I think is echoes what Louie said before, is that so the brain hasn't evolved to that. It just means that the word I wanted to pick up on and what you mean by the idea of neglect. Neglect seems to be an important part of the process. That's the point at which we now lose the sense that this actually seems to just basically emerge, and it now allows us to do these things. And it's these kinds of metacognitive processes that ties us into knots, because we're now engaging in thought processes which actually is kind of going beyond what the machinery, I'm using the words, evolved to cope with. Is that in essence what you're saying with this? Yeah.
No, that's a very good way to good way to put it.
So a lot of neglect in that is this idea. Tell me a bit more about that. How are you using the word neglect there?
Well, I mean, so I actually think I've solved the problem, and I mean, I think I can naturalize consciousness and meaning. I think it's even more important naturalizing meaning, and I think neglect, heuristic neglect in particular, is the key to doing that. Simply because neglect, which connotes this inability to not only know something, but to know that you don't know something. Donald Rumsfeld is famous for that press conference during the Iraq War, where he tried to explain to the press corps the difference between known knowns, unknown knowns, and unknown unknowns. And that's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about unknown unknowns here. Engineers sometimes call them unks. So those unknown unknowns, and the most dramatic example, of course, is Anton Babinski's syndrome. People who are blind but refuse to acknowledge or are unable to acknowledge their blindness and seem to confabulate vision and visual experiences. That's kind of what I'm suggesting happens to us every single time we pause and reflect on the nature of experience. Our metacognitive machinery is literally provides us a way to solve problems, right, while ignoring, neglecting, remaining insensitive to everything that's actually going on. And because it ignores what's going on, it is heuristic. So it turns on cues, it has a problem ecology, it's only able to solve certain problems. There's potential for exaptation, but they're always going to be severely constrained by the type of information rendered available in the first place. And so neglect actually provides a way to understand what it is we think we see when we reflect on the first person. So where the first person is something otherworldly, or something autonomous or something anomalous. I mean, pick your philosopher. When viewed from the perspective of metacognitive adequacy, where when you take the perspective of metacognitive neglect, all of a sudden, that's all the first person is. The first person, and what philosophers call the first person, is really basically a way of mistaking the neglect structure of human metacognition for something that is ontologically self-sufficient itself. So experience looks the way it does to reflection because of neglect. If you remove neglect from that equation, then it looks like something almost unbelievably impossible, something inconceivably special and anomalous and exceptional and what have you. And blind brain theory, which is the metacognitive portion of my theory, but heuristic neglect theory, which is the larger theoretical scheme, provides a way to actually translate the first person and claims made about the first person into third person terms. So, yeah, I mean, like I say, that's why I think for a philosopher, eliminativism is the type of position I'm espousing here. And the big problem with eliminativism is that it doesn't give you any horses to race in psychological research. So eliminativism is a non-starter in a great many quarters of psychology, simply because it doesn't say anything about intentional phenomena, and everything you guys study, right, involves intentional phenomena at some, crook or turn. Then obviously the eliminativist has nothing really to say to you that you would find interesting. The eliminativism I'm providing here is a eliminativism that gives an explanatory framework for what these intentional phenomena actually are. And so what I would like to claim is that if it were to be adopted in psychology circles, it would actually let a lot of the traditional conundrums, fade in the rearview mirror. That's my contention.
And Scott, to what extent then is it being adopted? So again, where is this theory? So you got the on alien philosophy article.
Yeah.
So that's one place where this is kind of expounded and discussed. Is there, to what extent do you feel as though people are picking this up and working with it and challenging it, or feeling as though actually this seems to be a good way to go into understanding some of these challenging questions?
Well, I mean, I'm getting published in peer review journals now, which is, I suppose, a good start. What the fact of the matter is that everybody's inundated with material now, and everybody has to basically do some sort of triage when they're trying to decide what they're going to read and what they're going to pay attention to. And we do that via different forms of social accreditation, right? And I'm a fantasy author. I mean, even worse, I write epic fantasy. And this, I have found, does not recommend me when it comes to these debates. So, I mean, interviews like this are the result of, me endeavoring to, I guess, take the gospel on the road.
Absolutely. And
actually talk to real psychologists, right?
And we'll let you know if we find any of those out there. But in terms of, you mentioned Dan Dennett then, so do you feel that it sits alongside that kind of theoretical approach, that it's not something that's kind of overtly challenging maybe where many theorists are right now, but actually this could add to what's already out there and being a respected approach to these kinds of, again, these challenging questions?
Yeah, I mean, depending on your familiarity with Dennett, I mean, Dennett's main theory of meaning, and you have to have a theory of meaning to be able to understand what cognition is, just simply because if you can't understand correctness and incorrectness, you just can't understand cognition. So Dennett's main theory is intentional systems theory, so the intentional stance. Now, my position bears a great number of superficial similarities to Dennett's, and I'm a huge fan of Dennett's. In fact, finishing his most recent book right now, what's it, From Bacteria to Bach and Back, and I'm absolutely loving it. But for me, he makes the same cardinal mistake that all philosophers make when it comes to posing these kinds of questions. I'm trying to figure out a way to frame this that isn't horribly long-winded. I mean, intentional cognition is heuristic cognition. We're trying to solve, you know, the most complicated objects and systems that we know of in the universe, right? Human beings with human brains. And we're trying to do this on the basis of a preposterously small amount of information. And so that's what intentional cognition consists of, ultimately. Ways to solve super complicated systems on the basis of small amounts of information. So intentional cognition, in other words, is a way for you to solve me and me to solve you and all of us to solve each other without knowing what's actually going on, right? And I mean, this is why cognitive science is such a huge reservoir of surprising findings. Everything they find about ourselves is something we don't know about ourselves, something that intentional cognition lets us get away with not knowing. And so what Dennett does with intentional systems theory, as far as I'm concerned, is make the same mistake all philosophers do, which is assume that intentional cognition, this special purpose, other people solver system we have, even though is designed to solve practical problems in the absence of information regarding what's really going on, the information you and your colleagues are hopefully providing. Even though that's its purpose, somehow we're supposed to expect that we can use intentional cognition theoretically to tell us the truth of intentional cognition. And that's what intentional systems theory is. It's an application of intentional cognition to the theoretical problem of intentional cognition. And so on my account, Dennett is kind of, I look at Dennett as being sort of the last gasp of this attempt by human beings to solve themselves in theoretical ways using intentional cognition.
And what you're saying is then, well, I don't know, but in terms of how I've understood it, and what you're saying is basically that you're on a hiding to nothing with that. Basically, you're not going to. It's. You say it's fundamentally flawed. That's the fundamental error they're making.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Hello. There's a lot of noise going on there. So just saying. So ask that again then. So, so if I understand that correctly, then you're saying that essentially, then it's a fundamentally flawed approach, because in order to use the phrase you're using, intentional cognition to understand intentional cognition, that ain't going to happen. It's not going to be possible.
It's not going to be possible. I mean, you can use it in all kinds of different ways. You can exact it to regiment certain problems, right? I mean, it's such a powerful tool. So, in say, psychological experiments involving intentional phenomena, basically what we're doing is we're using intentional cognition in a regimented way, in a regimented context, right, to track systematicities, right? I mean, because all these things are actually incredibly robust systems. And we can build all kinds of useful tools. So we can use intentional cognition, we can map that into, say, game theory. We can create a whole science, psychology, out of different regimentations of intentional cognition, right? But as soon as we actually ask intentional cognition to give us, the nature of something, then we've just simply forgotten what intentional cognition is, which is a way to actually solve things without knowing their natures. And I mean, this is it's hard to express how deeply this cuts against the grain of philosophical thought, and how much violence this view stirs in people's hearts, who are utterly committed to the history of philosophy. But I mean, you just look at philosophy, and it's a history of an incapacity of human beings to agree on anything basic about their own nature. And the fact that that tradition is incompatible with science, to me, just shouts that obviously there's some sort of short circuit going on here. Obviously there's a problem. Obviously we're not doing this right. And blind brain theory and heuristic neglect theory provide a way to actually see what it is we're doing wrong, how it is we can back the truck up, and hopefully, and this is purely speculative on my part, because I'm not a scientist, I'm just a theoretical wanker, who I think has been blessed by enough institutional independence to think out of the box in crazy ways that no academic could probably get away with if they were still in the system. Really provide a way to naturalize psychology. I mean, I think heuristic neglect theory might contain the kernel required to synthesize psychology into biology more generally.
And Scott, I was just going to say, I mean, I totally agree with you that, we are part of nature, and, but I mean, I must admit, I mean, I do see myself as an existentialist, and I do kind of, and I do think that we are part of nature, but apart from nature. And this is one of the things that I had reading your paper, for example, for me, biology can set the chessboard up, can constrain us, but we can actually choose. I mean, my feeling is we can choose to play the rules however we want, and whether that means slitting our wrists and saying "fuck you" to the universe. And and I kind of get everything you're saying. I just wonder again, the question I think we started off with, why you're not an existentialist again? I mean, do you fundamentally? Because I mean, I look inside myself, for example. I don't really see a Louie. I see lots of the things that you're talking about, the heuristics, the neglect. I see all of that. And I see identity. And I believe some of your fantasy covers identity, and for me, identity is fiction. I mean, Louie is a fiction, and again, so maybe the last question to you is, why not then an existentialist again?
Well, I mean, I guess just as former philosophy student, I mean, for me, existentialism means something very specific in terms of the types of commitments to things like fundamental ontology, for instance. To be existentialist in a less philosophical sense, which seems to me to be what you're describing, I don't have a problem. I really don't have a problem with that. I'm actually a big fan of sort of informal reflection on these problems, just simply because I think the problems are so deep, and I think informality in these things is exactly what leads to creativity. And anytime you have a big problem, creativity is exactly what you need. So I'm not going to tell you to stop being an existentialist. What I will say, though, is that you can say that self is a fiction, and that's very, very hard for rank and file individual to be able to make sense of. But when you start saying things like fiction is a fiction, then things start getting really, really difficult. I mean, they become almost impassably counterintuitive. And part of my project I see as one of trying to actually make sense of that for people. So nihilism, semantic nihilism, for instance. It is true that there is no such thing as truth. Now, how do you make that make sense to a person? But I think in about 40, 50 years or so, that the dogma, the scientific dogma that is animating cognitive science will actually agree with me that it is true that there's no such thing as truth. that first application, is it true, is the application of a heuristic system, right, that's making do with this unbelievable absence of information, right, but yet still having to, in some way, shape, or form, communicate reliability, whereas truth, the philosophical phenomena of truth, that's an artifact of thousands of years of people applying intentional cognition to the problem of intentional cognition. And it seems unthinkable that you can use truth talk and say there's no such thing as truth at the same time. It seems like the most obvious contradiction in the world. But once you see how fractionate and how heuristic all the different aspects of human cognition are, you can suddenly see that, no, this is exactly the kind of confusion that human beings should expect to find themselves in, right, given the cognitive biology nature has stranded them with.
My head hurts.
Well, I was going to say, and any conscious creature in the universe, taking
Any
us back to your alien philosophy, is going to have the same headaches.
I think if we do bump into aliens, that we'll find that they too, just simply because metacognition is so expensive, that they too, were utterly blind to themselves, so blind that they didn't even realize they were blind. So they suffered this strange blindness where they thought that they could see everything they needed to see to solve whatever question they posed regarding their own nature. And that's been the case throughout human history. It's like no one ever said, "Egad, we don't know enough about experience. Why are we even trusting this?" Right? I mean, well, the ancient skeptics, of course, are the famous exception.
Well, I'm gonna lie down.
I think I'm gonna go and try and read one of your fancy books, Scott. I mean, I'm hoping it isn't going to remind me of my hatred for Tolkien, but I'm hoping for the existential aspect is going to draw me in.
And also, interestingly, if you remember, Louie, one of the possible titles for this podcast was going to be a theoretical wanker, which I quite like that. Maybe we should go back to that as a title for the podcast. So
I am the biggest theoretical wanker you will find outside of a university, I'm pretty sure.
But I mean, I would also say, I mean, keep up the good work, Scott. I mean, you're obviously, I mean, you're making our brains hurt because, I mean, I feel kind of small brain compared to this, don't you, Matt? I mean,
absolutely. Do I even have a brain? I'm blind. I'm fucked, basically.
So I mean, keep up the good work, and hopefully we'll catch up with you again in the future, and chat. And hopefully you've destroyed all of Western philosophy, and they've built your statue, and and we can say we talked to you before that happened. So thank you for taking part, Scott. It was lovely chatting to you.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Scott. Appreciate it.
Thank you, guys. Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye for now.